Hi, I'm Claire Ridgway. I'm author of several books on Anne Boleyn and the Boleyn family, and also founder of the Anne Boleyn Files website and the Tudor Society website. I'm here today with this latest instalment in my series, Questions about Anne Boleyn. And today's question that I'm going to be looking at and trying to answer is, was Anne Boleyn charged with witchcraft? Now, today's video is based on excerpts that I've taken from a chapter of my book, The Anne Boleyn Collection 2, and also an article that I wrote for Susan Higginbotham and her blog History Refreshed on Anne Boleyn and the alleged charge of witchcraft. Now, every year around the 19th of May, when I'm doing my sort of posts on the countdown to Anne Boleyn's execution, I notice lots of comments on my website and also on social media regarding Anne Boleyn being charged with witchcraft and being accused of being a witch. This has also come up recently on my YouTube channel when I posted my video, Did Anne Boleyn Miscarry a Deformed Fetus? I received comments about how this alleged deformed fetus was used to promote the idea that, Anne was a witch and to bolster the charge of witchcraft at her trial. Now, something that's not true at all, but I'm going to be going into this. Now, Anne Boleyn's name is often linked with witchcraft, and many people make the assumption that she was charged with witchcraft, that it was in the indictments of charges laid against her in May 1536. And some fiction has run with this idea. And I know fiction is fiction. Historical fiction, we shouldn't take it as true. It's just inspired by historical events. But fiction can be powerful, and some people do take it as face value, and they do take it as an accurate retelling. And some fiction has run with the idea that Anne Boleyn was a witch. For example, The Other Boleyn Girl, the famous Anne Boleyn novel by Philippa Gregory, which of course was turned into a movie and a BBC adaptation as well. That depicted Anne Boleyn as dabbling in witchcraft, taking a potion to bring on the miscarriage of a baby, which then turns out to be monstrously deformed. And then there's a witch taker that helps to take her down in 1536. So all very witchy. Anne Boleyn is this person that dabbles in witchcraft for her own gain. But it's not only fiction that makes Anne Boleyn out to be a witch. There are factual, well, I'm saying that they're factual, but obviously if there's mistakes on them, they're not factual. But they claim to be factual websites. And they state that she was charged with witchcraft in 1536. I've read some saying that the moles that she was said to have on her body were claimed to be witches' teats, evidence of her being a witch, that her alleged extra finger was taken as evidence that she was a witch. It was the sign of a witch. And an article on the BBC History website, which you would expect to be reputable and accurate, referred to her being accused of being a disciple of witchcraft. So you can understand why people assume that witchcraft was brought up in 1536 and that Anne was accused of being a witch. And some non-fiction authors and historians have also given credence to the witchcraft theory. I've got this book here. It has actually been republished by Anne Boleyn, but this is the original copy of it. It's the biography by Nora Lofts. She's also written fiction on Anne Boleyn, but this is a biography by her. And in this factual biography, she describes Anne as having a mole, which was known as the devil's paw mark. and of making a typical witch's threat when she was in the Tower of London, where she claimed, bells are ringing out for Anne being in the Tower of London, where she claimed that there would be no rain in England for 7 years now that she'd been, imprisoned in the Tower of London. And Nora Lofts explains in this book that 7 was a magic number and that witches were thought to control the weather. So that's evidence, that she was a witch. What's more, Nora Lofts talks about Anne having a dog named Urian, one of the names given to Satan. Well, actually, she didn't have a dog named Urian at all. You can find out more about that in my video on Anne Boleyn's pets. Then there's the fact that, she managed to cast a spell on Henry VIII, which, the spell lasted for a few years, but then sadly ran out in 1536, and Henry began to sort of see the truth, hence his violent reaction and what Lofts describes as the passing from adoration to hatred. And then Lofts goes even further than this, where she writes about a story of Anne haunting Saul Church in Norfolk, where, according to legend, there is one legend that Anne's body isn't in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, that it was secretly taken away to this church in Norfolk and buried there. And Lofts talks about this legend, but she also writes of a visit that she made to the church there, where she met the sexton of the church. And he told Lofts that he kept vigil on the 19th of May, the anniversary of Anne's execution, to see if Anne's ghost appeared. And he didn't see a ghost, but he did see a huge hare which seemed to come from nowhere, which jumped around the church before vanishing into thin air. And Lofts writes in this, while she was supposed to be a witch, he asked blankly what that had got to do with it. I had the pleasure of telling him that a hare was one of the shapes that a witch was supposed to be able to take at will, which is one reason why many Norfolk people would have to be very near starvation before they would eat hare meat. He'd never heard that one, he said, so he'd regarded his ghost hunt as a failure and had told his tale in all innocence. It left me wondering. How typical of a woman who loved a joke, who enjoyed masquerades, who'd led another man a fine chase, to make a brief reappearance, not as a headless spectre, or as a whole one, self-pitying and woebegone, but as an animal, beautiful and lively, and as elusive as ever. And there is a picture of the hare. So she talks about, Anne Boleyn coming back to the church, but as a hare being one of the shapes that a witch could take at will. Now, yes, you can kind of hear my sarcasm and my disbelief there. That's in what is supposed to be a serious biography of Anne Boleyn, but we have, Anne Boleyn being a witch. Then we have Retha Warnick's view on Anne Boleyn, and Retha Warnick is an excellent historian, an academic historian, and she wrote a book, The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn, which has got some interesting theories on Anne Boleyn's fall, and they're not ones that I agree with. She puts forward the idea that the men caught up in Anne's fall in May 1536, that's Sir Henry Norris, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Sir Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton and William Brereton, that they were all what she calls libertines who practiced sodomy. Then there's incest, which Anne and George were charged with, and that incest and sodomy, as Warnick notes, were associated with the practice of witchcraft. And she also thinks that the rather lurid mentions in the indictments, and the indictments are it's really scandalous language for the time, These lurid mentions of Anne sort of procuring the men, inciting them to have sexual relations with her, that this was consistent with the need to prove that she was a witch. She continues saying that the licentious charges against the Queen, even if the rumours of her attempted poisonings and of her causing her husband's impotence were never introduced into any of the trials, indicate that Henry believed that she was a witch. But although Anne and George were charged with incest, and Anne was accused of seducing and sleeping with the men, there is no mention in the indictments of the men having sexual relationships with each other or other men. And there's no gossip either. There's no gossip. There's nothing in the chronicles, in the dispatches of the time about these men having what would have been seen unnatural relations with other men. Henry VIII may well have said that in his blustering that he'd been forced into this second marriage by sortilege and charms. But I don't believe for 1 second that means that Henry was completely 100% convinced that Anne was a witch. What he was saying there is that he was kind of bewitched by Anne, that he fell under her spell. That just because he uses that kind of language, spell, charms, sortilege, that doesn't mean that he is actually accusing Anne of witchcraft. I think that is too much of a leap. And if Henry was convinced of that, if he really was convinced that he'd been bewitched into this marriage, then surely Thomas Cromwell, who was in charge of putting the case together, would have used this this claim to get Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn annulled, because if Anne was a witch and she'd put a spell on Henry, he'd fallen under this spell and he hadn't been in his right mind and he'd been tricked into marriage, then surely that made the marriage invalid, and that would have been kind of an easy way of annulling it. Anne Boleyn was charged with adultery. She was charged with plotting the king's death with the other men. She was charged with committing incest with her brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. But there is absolutely no mention of witchcraft or sorcery or anything like that in the indictments drawn up by the Middlesex and Kent grand juries. They were the juries that were in charge of drawing up the indictments which listed the charges against her and the men in 1536. And there is no mention of anything at all witchy in her subsequent trial. Now, although witchcraft wasn't a felony or a crime punishable by death until the Act of 1542, so 6 years after Anne Boleyn's execution, a suggestion of witchcraft could have helped the Crown, I believe. It could have helped with the annulment. It could have served as propaganda. This woman hasn't only committed adultery and seduced these men, but she's used spells as well. And it really would have been another way to blacken the Boleyn name. But there's no mention of it. It was not used in that way. So where does this idea, this prevalent idea, this idea that you see everywhere and that people just assume, that it's true, where does the whole witchcraft charge idea come from if it wasn't mentioned in 1536? Well, I think we can put a little bit of the blame on the Catholic writer, the Catholic recusant Nicholas Sander, who in 1585 described Anne Boleyn as having a projecting tooth, an extra finger on her right hand, a large wen under her chin, and all that, as I've said before, sounds rather like Nanny McPhee. It's your kind of stereotypical image of, a witch, what we'd see as kind of an old hag, that really stereotypical image of a witch. Then there's the claim that I've spoken about before in my Did Anne Boleyn Have a Deformed Fetus? That Anne Boleyn miscarried a shapeless mass of flesh, the miscarriage that she had in January 1536. Now, this shapeless mass of flesh, which he talks about, was turned into something else by historical fiction writer Philippa Gregory in The Other Boleyn Girl. She turned it into a monster, a baby horridly malformed with a spine flayed open and a huge head, twice as large as the spindly little body. And this was used in her novel to back up the idea that Anne had committed incest and she dabbled in witchcraft, and that was the result of her doing that. But as I've explained in my videos on the idea that Anne had an extra finger and that she miscarried a deformed fetus, Nicholas Sander was a Catholic in exile during Elizabeth I's reign. He had no first-hand knowledge of Anne Boleyn. He was born circa 1530, so he was only 6 years old, thereabouts, when Anne was executed. He wasn't at court. He didn't know her. It's unlikely he ever saw her. He was writing nearly 50 years after her death. He was writing propaganda in an attempt to blacken Elizabeth I's name and the names of her parents, who he held responsible for the break with Rome and all the trouble that subsequently caused for Catholics in England. He was forced into exile because of it. So he's an enemy to Elizabeth I and her mother, Anne Boleyn. So, Catholic propaganda. Anne Boleyn was not charged with witchcraft, as I said. None of her contemporaries accused her of being a witch. Anne Boleyn's moles that she seems to have had were simply moles. It doesn't appear that she had a wen or a projecting tooth. That is all, as I said, Catholic propaganda. It is not, Sander's description of Anne is not backed up by any contemporary reports at all. So Anne's moles were simply moles. Her mention of the weather in the tower, it not raining for 7 years, was just the ramblings of a hysterical, terrified woman who must have known that there was no way she was coming out of that tower again alive. The hair seen at the church in Norfolk was just a hair. There's no evidence to prove that the men who were executed in May 1536 were what Warnock describes as libertines. And the only evidence for the deformed fetus is Nicholas Sander. Also, Henry's words concerning sortilege and charms were more likely to have been bluster from a king who was, who was blustering about, this Anne Boleyn, that look what's happened, rather than being a serious accusation. He also said in his blustering that Anne had had over 100 lovers and that she'd tried to poison his son, Henry Fitzroy. She'd tried to poison his daughter, Mary. This is just the bluster of an angry and defensive man, surely, rather than something to take seriously. If these were serious claims, then surely all of that would have been included in the indictment. She would have been charged with having that many lovers. She would have been charged with attempting to murder the king's illegitimate son and his daughter, Mary. So none of that makes sense. Anne Boleyn the Witch makes interesting fiction, definitely. And I find it funny that you see her portrait on the wall of Hogwarts in the Harry Potter movies. I'd put her in Ravenclaw, by the way. But she wasn't a witch, and there is absolutely nothing in the contemporary sources that even, accuse her. In all the blackening of her name at the time, her name being really drawn through the mud, there's no one called her a witch. This is a very sort of modern invention. So she wasn't a witch, I'm afraid to say. To use the language of J.K. Rowling, she was a muggle. So I'm very sorry, but Anne Boleyn wasn't a witch. Now, you can subscribe to this channel by just clicking on the button there. Hit the bell to be notified of future videos as well. I hope you're enjoying this series, answering your questions about Anne Boleyn. I'm really, really enjoying answering them and doing a bit of extra research into them. Anyway, I'd love to hear your comments, hear your views on this. It's always good to get feedback. Anyway, I will see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.